Hi, I'm John from the Christian Century, and I'm joined today by Jeannine Pitas, a frequent contributor to the Christian Century. Today, we're actually going to chat about a book of poetry that Jeannine has written that is going to be released soon in March by Paraclete Press. The book is called Or and, that's or slash and. We're going to hear a couple poems from the book. We're going to chat about them. But first, Jeannine, hello, and why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeannine Pitas. As John said, I am a freelance writer and contributor to the Christian Century, among other publications. I recently moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'm teaching at St. Vincent College, but I am proud to call Buffalo, New York, my home.
That's excellent. I am proud to call Pittsburgh my home, even though I live in Chicago. So I'm glad you're there. That's good for Pittsburgh. And anyway, why don't we start with you reading one of your poems? And I believe you're going to read for us one of the poems that the book is sort of named after, a poem called Or.
Yes, or. It's a word that reminds you you're not the world. You've never liked it. You prefer the ecstatic frenzy of and, the heaping of spaghetti and chocolate pudding and mango onto plates without any fear of stomachache. But now you're 3.5 decades into your journey and you're in a dark wood and you think it's Dante's, but fear it's Frost's, with two paths diverging, and you can't follow both and be one traveler. And you ask why you have to pick, and you'd like to split yourself in two, maybe a sober daytime Apollonian you and a drunken nighttime Dionysian one. And you try to do this, but there's a limit to how far they'll walk away from each other. You seek a middle way, even though it might send you over the rocks, straight into the brambles. You don't care how much they scrape. A therapist says you need to learn to say no, that boundaries form identity, but you rally against those who enforce political borders. In 1922, thousands of Greeks were marched into Turkey, Turks into Greece. Today in Thessaloniki, you read a message written on a wall: borders kill people. In 1947, India was partitioned. 2 million died due to lines drawn on a map. You don't want to be a country with armed guards posted. No, you can't be the world. But even at this age, you still want to be the sea, that seemingly infinite network of forkless paths, that blue container of brown and green land. And everyone knows there is only one sea.
Thank you for reading this work for us. I love this poem. I will say most of the poetry I've read is what we publish in the Century, and most of those poems, if not all of them, have sort of easily detectable formal structure. There are stanzas made up of lines that maybe have meter. And this poem, which I have read on in writing, in addition to hearing you read it, is like prose poetry. It looks like a paragraph. So I'm curious, just if you wanted to tell us a little bit about your choice to write this poem in that particular style, and is that typical for you? And just tell us a little more about the prose poetry.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So prose poetry has a long history, a long tradition. It was really popularized by the Surrealists in the early 20th century. And I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm also a Spanish-English literary translator. And the writer I've spent the most time translating and whom I've also studied academically is an Uruguayan poet called Marosa Di Giorgio, who writes almost exclusively in prose poetry. Her poems are almost like little stories. And then she has other books of what she calls stories, but they're really very similar to her poems. So she really plays with genre in that way. I wouldn't say I'm deliberately imitating her. I mean, in terms of content, this is very different from what she writes. But I think being around that style for so long, working on her, has influenced me. But I think like one effect of the prose poem at least in this case, in this one that I just read for you, is there's a sort of urgency and this kind of anxiety of, you know, and this and that and that. There's this sort of buildup of tension in the poem and a sense of like being overwhelmed. And I think the prose has that effect. It's not broken into stanzas. So the book contains a mix. It contains poems in prose, and most of the poems are in traditional stanzas like you expect from poetry, but this is not the only poem in the book that takes that prose form.
That's great. Thanks for explaining that. Another thing I noticed right away when reading this poem is that it's in the second person. The first line, it, the word, or reminds you you're not the world. And I just was curious about that choice. It seems like reading the poem, you are perhaps writing about yourself, but you are writing it in the second person. So I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that decision.
So I will tell all readers of poetry, never assume that the poet is the speaker of the poem, even if it's an I narrator. There's always a distance there, even when you are writing about your own experience. I will be honest, my poetry tends to come very much from personal experience and things that I'm going through in my life and emotions, etc. But there's always a difference, even when it is an I narrator, an I voice, between the I who's speaking in the poem and the I who's the writer, because we all contain multitudes, you know, to misquote Walt Whitman. And so a voice in a poem is just one voice of a writer. I would say that one effect of the you, very often you is a stand-in for I when it's used. Or it can be actually addressing a you, or it might be kind of a kind of general genderless stand-in for a third person. I think for me, I could have just easily written it as an I. I think I chose the you in part just writing this because it's such a personal topic, very close to me. I wanted to get some distance from it. So you is a little bit distancing. And it also has the effect of hopefully drawing readers in. I'm hoping that some readers might be able to relate to these sentiments and find themselves and their own stories within this particular poem.
Well, I don't know about other readers, but I did relate to some of what was in this poem. Okay, finally, just wanted to ask about the book as a whole, what is the book about? What is it trying to do? And how does the poem that we just heard kind of fit into the message or the art of the book?
So how do I say this? That this book is kind of based on my early midlife crisis. I mean, you know, I mentioned Dante's woods, right? Of finding himself in a dark wood in the middle of our lives, which is age 35. Nowadays, a lot of us expect to live a lot longer than 70, but of course we never know. But I think for me, my 20s were a time of feeling like the world was expanding, like my world was expanding. There were all these limitless opportunities. And the 30s, my 30s, have been a time of some contracting, of realizing that the choices that we make do limit us, that there are consequences to every choice that we make, that sometimes we desire more than we can have. We want it all, and that's just not possible. But then there are also limits that we impose upon ourselves that maybe wouldn't need to exist. And discerning what's a real limit and what is a self-imposed limit can be really, really difficult. And I think ultimately that's what this book is about. It's about bumping up against limits and desiring to go beyond them and asking that question of, when is it possible to go beyond limits? When do we really have to respect the limits that are there? And the book has 3 sections. And I kind of see it almost as a sort of creation, fall, and redemption story in some ways. So the first part has poetry based somewhat in my youth and growing up, that kind of thing. And then the second part, which the poem I just read for you is from, kind of goes into a moment in my life when some bad choices that I had made really did make me feel very limited and very stuck and very trapped, and in a lot of emotional pain and causing pain for others. And then the third part is how I sort of found my way out of that. I don't think I fully found my way out of it, but how with God's help. And also I have to really mention one thing that I've spent time doing over the last several years is immigrant solidarity work, interpreting for young immigrants in Dubuque, Iowa, where I was living right before I moved here to Pittsburgh, in various settings. So that has that story finds its way into this book. And a young woman for whom I became a legal guardian as she was seeking legal status in this country lived with me for 2 years. And she ended up having a huge impact on my life at that time. And the book is dedicated both to my deceased former philosophy professor and to her, to Magdalena. And so she plays a big role in this, in the third part of the story. She was a very positive and is a very positive influence in my life. So that's kind of the structure.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with us. That provides a lot of really good context for this book and makes me more excited to read it. So to close, you have offered to do another reading, a bonus poetry reading from this book. So let's hear another poem from Or And.
Thank you so much. So this one is called Buen Camino, and it references the ancient and medieval pilgrimage route across Spain, the Camino de Santiago, which I had the privilege of walking back in 2014. And it's an experience that has stayed with me. And I was actually thinking about it. I wrote this poem actually in New Mexico in 2021 on a trip with students. So this poem is in the third section toward the end of the book. So I will close with that. Buen Camino. As I walk, you walk with me. 20, 50, more than I can count. You form a procession of angels climbing the mountain. Your footsteps so loud, they drown out the song of the white-breasted desert lark. Your all too human sweat competing with sagebrush fragrance. I called you here, you who no longer send me Christmas cards or birthday greetings, you whose numbers I forget, whose addresses I've erased. First grade drawing companion, Nicole M., fellow pilgrim around a cul-de-sac in Cheektowaga, New York, selling thin mints and peanut butter patties each Girl Scout cookie season. Here you are now, offering me a hand to hold for the slippery ascent. Pablo of a midnight walk along the Rio de la Plata, one silver hot December night, our shoes filled with sand from the beach of a city that loves the sea. Here you are now, showing me which rocks are safe. Cecilia of a dank August stroll along the Mississippi River, marching toward Gatsby's green light. Here you are now, warning that the path narrows ahead. Ben of a confused romp down Frenchman's Street, both of us strangers in the city of jazz and colored beads, the drunk leading the drunk past the tap dancer with a baby in his arms. Here you are now, tapping my shoulder and pointing up to the soaring hawk I missed while counting steps. You, my brothers, my sisters, my loves, it is not your death I grieve, but my own, since I am the ghost who wants to haunt you as you continue on paths chosen without me. Maybe not even a very orderly mind can endure the discovery of not being loved. And yet still I love anyone, anywhere, as much as I want, which is why I've called you here as I approach the labyrinth's center, as I ascend sharp rocks to smooth sands above. And you have come, shadows whose footsteps I follow, as I dream of a mesa where we might rest together to marvel at the same red and blue mountains. And if I open my eyes and find myself alone, I will still call out Buen Camino. I will keep shouting love to each one of you, even if you won't hear me.
Wow, thank you. That is a beautiful poem. Well, everyone out there, if you are interested in Jeannine's work, there will be a few links below in the video description. One will be a link to just all the pieces Jeannine has written for the Christian Century. There will also be a link, of course, where you can pre-order this book of poetry we have been discussing, so make sure to click that below. Jeannine, thank you so much for joining us today and reading your poems and chatting with us.
Thank you for having me. And to listeners, thank you for listening.